All right, welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to have you here today. I'm joined by an incredible panel of people who are going to be talking a little bit about 1984 today and the sense, the feeling, the understanding that we have about the events of 1984 and the Sikh Genocide and the moments that have led us from that point to where we are today, and how many events that we're dealing with right now, current events, political, social, economic events that are happening in India, unfolding as we speak, can somehow be traced back to, in some way, shape, or form, the history of Sikhs in India and the number of trials and tribulations that the Sikh community has been through during that time. So while the focus of today's event will be very much on sort of like the diaspora understanding of 1984 and the decades since, at the same time, we are, of course, open to most of your questions. I will say in advance of the session, though, keep in mind that, there are some questions that you may be asking that will require more of an expert analysis or an expert answer. And in that case, we might have another session that follows this one. But for the time being, the panelists here will be able to speak to their own experiences. They'll be able to speak to this matter from their own professional experience and their knowledge. But there are some questions that may be outside our wheelhouse, in which case we'll certainly document them, but there might not be an opportunity to address them in as much detail as we would like. So welcome, panelists. Thanks everybody for being here. So I'd like to start with Guntaas, who is in the top left corner of my screen. Guntaas is a lawyer. She is the vice president in BC for the World Sikh Organization. My name is Rena Heer. I am a former journalist, now communications professional. I often moderate and host these types of conversations in my professional life and in my personal and volunteer life. So it is a honor to share the panel with the guests here today. I'm also joined by Paramvir Singh Deol, who is a third-year Kinesiology student, but also the president of the Sikh Students Association at Simon Fraser University. I'm joined by Amneet Singh Bali, who is a legal researcher, a political strategist, and I believe also digital director for the NDP. So pleasure to have all of you here today. And I'll let you speak a little bit to your experience and to your individual connection did I not introduce Paneet?
No.
My dear. And somebody else said they couldn't multitask. I can't multitask. We're also joined by Paneet Singh, who is a playwright and a filmmaker. And if you were fortunate enough to catch any of his work, then you will know that his work is infused with so many different pieces of his identity that might help you connect with something in your own life in a way that's very meaningful and just full of depth. So anyhow, excited to have this panel for you today. And the first question I'll start with is, please, if I've missed anything in your introduction, please make sure that you tell the audience what it is that you need them to know. But I guess the first question, just to start things off, is give us an idea as to what your personal connection to 1984 is, or how it is that you arrived at a deeper understanding of the events of 1984 and the implications they've had for our community. And I'll start with Guntaas.
Sorry, I was wearing two hats at the moment when you asked the question. I'm gonna bunt it over to whoever you'd like. Just give me 1 second. I'm also playing background host on the webinar for the WSO.
No problem. Let's start with
apologize for the no, that's okay. And I'll have you, if you don't mind, repeating the question just so I have it clear.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question is, please feel free to do a bit of a level set and let our audience know anything that I missed in your introduction or in your bio that can add to this discussion. And really just from a personal perspective, when did you better start to understand sort of the events of 1984 from a personal level and the implications that moment in time has had for our community?
So you didn't miss anything in my introduction at all. And I'm grateful to be here on this panel and honored. I'm currently coming to you from Richmond, British Columbia, which has traditionally been the territory of the Cowichan, the Musqueam, and the Coast Salish peoples. In terms of my own connection to 1984, I don't have a personal connection, as I don't have, at least to my knowledge, anyone that was directly impacted on during the events of 1984, the genocide. But in terms of, as a diaspora member, my parents were certainly here in British Columbia, in Vancouver, as the events unfolded. And they were present during the protests and I think the community being in kind of in the dark, literally, quite literally. Personally, I explored it, and I think everyone, if you've been on our Instagram recently, you happen to see a clip where I shared last year that I experienced it for the first time as a 16-year-old attending a vigil, and like many others, perhaps not exactly knowing why I was there or what the events were. Growing up, you heard references to Golden Temple, to Indira Gandhi, to attack, but you didn't, and the images inside gurdwaras, but I don't think I connected with the actual events and the stories until I was 19, and I attended an event at Ottawa University where pictures of the aftermath of Operation Blue Star, or the direct attack on Harmandir Sahib, and the subsequent attacks after Operation Woodrose and others were shared, and they were pictures that were smuggled out of India, Punjab, on someone's actual person. They were stitched into their clothing, they were hidden in their shoes, lined in their suitcase. And to me, this was, if I can say anything, but, it probably made me dumbstruck. It caught me so unawares and so off guard. So that's my initial foray into the exploration. And I think it's, from that point, has now become a 20-year journey. So.
Thank you. Amneet?
So let's start off with the Fateh. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I'm really honored to be here with everyone. And I'm based in Ottawa, so the unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. So yeah, I mean, for you didn't miss anything in the introduction, so thank you for that. But in terms of how, I guess I became passionate or introduced to 1984 and the Sikh Genocide, one of my earliest memories is going to Gurdwara as a kid. And there was a bulletin. So I grew up in London, Ontario. And every week there was a new picture up on this bulletin board. And it was a picture of a tortured body. And being an innocent child, I remember going in and seeing that there was a new picture every Sunday when we went to Gurdwara. It was a small community. And one week there wasn't a new picture. And so I actually asked my dad pretty innocently, like, why isn't there a new picture? It was like one of those things you'd run up and then you'd run away as a kid, not really understanding the gravity of what was going on. And my dad was like, you should ask Uncle G, like ask one of the committee members. So I asked him, and he's like, well, we didn't receive anything this week. And that kind of goes to what Guntaas Kaur was talking about, that no new photo had been smuggled out. So we didn't know what was going on that week. So that was kind of one of my earliest memories. And then, my family, my father, my parents, my older brother would talk about it a little bit, but a bit of a maybe like unorthodox way of kind of really finding a connection was like, and this is going to sound maybe kind of funny, is that I really cared about social justice growing up as something that was instilled in me, and I attribute it to Sikhi specifically. But when I went into high school, I really got into hip hop music. I really got into rap, and one of my favorite rappers of all time, and continues to be my favorite rapper of all time, was Tupac. But I was really drawn to his the social justice element of what he was rapping about. And that took me down the path of, like, I think we call it doom scrolling today, of wanting to learn about the Black Civil Rights Movement, wanting to learn about revolutionaries and human rights activists and whatnot. But there was always this sort of thing that didn't really immediately connect with me, because although I could empathize, it didn't really speak exactly to what I was experiencing, or that kind of missing, that missing piece in my life. And when I was in grade 10, one of my cousins handed me a book, and that book was Fighting for Faith and Nation, Dialogue with Sikh Militants by Cynthia Kepley Mahmood. Hope I pronounced that correctly. And that profoundly just changed everything for me. I read that book from cover to cover, and I appreciate that piece of literature till this day because it is so unbiased and just tells it how it is. and all of those things that I experienced, all those things that throughout my life that kind of culminated, finally added up. My passion for social justice, my understanding of that moment when I was a kid, those conversations in the household, to connecting that affinity for social justice and the Black Civil Rights Movement to what was happening to my community and my people and what we were going through, and basically being able to give a face to the emotions that I was facing. And from then on, I really just, I delved deep, whether it was academia, professional work, activism, etc. And I would just wanted to learn more and more. And through that process, there was a bit of like, trauma, I would say. Like there's a lot of trying to process what you're seeing and healing. And so kind of, I think that's how I came to learn of 1984. And that's my connection to it.
Paneet?
Thank you, Rena. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for your more than generous introduction. And I'm calling in today from the unceded, the ancestral, the stolen territory of the Hunkaminam and Skohomish-speaking nations of the Musqueam and the Tsleil-Waututh in shared relationship with the Stalo. And I'm honored to be in this place where I have the privilege of existence, of community building, of practicing my faith, of building spirituality, connecting to ancestors, and hopefully with some humble attempts, dedicating some energy and spirit to the causes which are relevant and pressing to our elder cousins, the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And I invite everyone that's on this panel to take a moment to reflect on where they're calling in from and what their relationship is to the land and the steward of the land since time immemorial. So thank you. And it's an honor to be here alongside all of you. And when it comes to personal connection, it's interesting. My story lies somewhere exactly between what Guntaas, Kaur, and Amneet Singh shared. My first exposition to 1984 was at the Vancouver Candlelight Vigil. It was probably 2001. I had no clue. I was 11 years old. I had no clue that this had ever happened. My family background, it's a family that came into Sikhi, became an Amritari family, or at least partially in the late 80s, in the early 90s. What was a little bit unique about it, it had that process of spirituality building and that process of becoming Amritari for the family wasn't linked to 84. There was no alignment between the two. My dad's family has been here since the 1970s, the mid 70s. In Vancouver, people probably know, was a very politically charged time. Head covering was at the center of it. Obviously, politics in India are informing the factionalism that's happening here. And I mean, the day that my parents, my dad's family, who lived in South Vancouver, got here, right next to Rostri Gurdwara, which is Khalsa Diwan Society, was the epicenter of the diaspora in the 80s. Like, everyone looked towards Ross to see and copied their models across the world. And despite the fact that they lived next door, almost literally, to Rostri Gurdwara, one of my parents' first experiences, my dad's first experiences at the Gurdwara, was going there, and there was fights going on between head covering and literally fist fights happening at the Gurdwara. They stopped going. They never went to Ross again unless Bhai Bakshi Singh was in town, or a big Ragi, or there was a big event. They went to Akali Singh, which was 40 blocks away, but much less politically charged, much more aligned with their experiences growing up in the culture of Sikhi in India. So the divorcing of of the political happened early on, I think, in the narrative that I've built in my family history through the gift of retrospect. But I mean, that carried on. So when I was 11, I learned about 84 for the first time. It was by the expansion and growth of Sangat. And then from there, I think my relationship to 84 has been informed by my life's experiences. I became but still to this day, my closest mentor in my life has been my Guntaas by Charanjit Singh, who passed away in 2004, who came from the Dandri Tiksal. So like a direct lineage to Sant Jarnail Singh's legacy and metta, like was then passed on through that martial lens. So I carried that forward, and that plus like the human rights side of it. And when I was in grade 11, got really into Malcolm X. I think a little bit after that is when Amneet Singh and I met and started talking on MSN. I still remember those days. But then like that side of it, looking at it as a broader human rights issue and where it fit within the scope of other atrocities that had happened and were happening throughout the world. University amplified that into academia kind of understanding. I was very inspired by the Sikh Activist Network, to be honest, which Amneet Singh was doing. And again, those MSN conversations, like my networks were expanding. I had a very, very humble, small role, an opportunity to do seva at the candlelight vigils that happened in Vancouver when the sevadars who were carrying that forward, they were really big and making a very big impact in the early 2010s. But in that time is when it still felt like an India issue the whole time. It felt like this is something that happened in India, and this is always something that we were satellite to and experience. And that changed probably in about 2009 and 10, about there, when I was given a VCR to digitize by a friend who's Masard, I think, had recorded all the newscasts from local BCC TV, global, well, that wasn't around back then, CBC, but all like the local broadcasts, recorded every single broadcast from basically June 1st to 10th. And so when I was digitizing, I watched it back, and it never felt more real and more connected to me than when I saw rallies that I had been attending since I was 11 years old happening on June 10th, 1984, and having 1, 2, 3, 4 out of every 4 Sikhs in British Columbia attending that rally, seeing the emotion, seeing the events play out in real time, seeing the manufacturing and the repression of information, seeing that play out in front of you through an archival source was something that shook me, and that ended up being, when it moved forward, that ended up being the basis for writing a Vancouver Guntaas, the play that I wrote about the Vancouver experience of 1984. So that's a long-winded answer. I apologize, but it's been something to say that 84 has existed sometime since I was a preteen, and my connection to it has always been a reflection of where my spiritual, political, and social understanding has been as an individual and as a Sikh.
Great, thank you. Paramvir, over to you. And if you have any questions about what it means to chat over MSN, I'm sure there are a couple of people who do. What does that mean exactly? Let us know. But yeah, same question for you, essentially. I mean, there are going to be generational differences. Even when I look at Amneet, or I'm talking to Paneet or Guntaas, I'm older than them. I was fully aware of the events of 1984. They were happening around me. I remember the calls. I remember like parents talking to people in India, trying to figure out whether everybody was okay. And the years after that, when family members arrived here as refugees. So I have some understanding of that. So yours too, just from your perspective, is going to be different. So what was your first experience or interaction with sort of understanding the significance of 1984?
I'd like to start with a fateh. So Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. First of all, I'm really honored to share the panel with a lot of accomplished individuals, must I say. It's truly humbling. Unlike the others, I fall into a boat where there's a huge generational difference between the events that took place and how I got to know about them. There isn't really like a specific date or moment that I can pinpoint in my life where I can say, this is where 84 was first introduced to me. It's kind of been a gray area, and it always will be a gray area. But in terms of how I got more comfortable even learning about the issue, that is truly quite recent. And even in terms of talking about the issue, I'm still struggling to articulate my thoughts. So my apologies in advance due to it being such a hard-hitting topic, right? For me, 84, since it does touch upon the topic of intergenerational trauma, to be quite honest, if I would ever ask my parents, they would try to avoid the topic. And that isn't even like a repression of information. They just did not want to pass on the trauma. So to be honest, I'm not till this day truly sure if I have family members that were affected by this, because such information was not disclosed and just pushed aside. And in terms of it being intergenerational trauma, it's much more important to articulate that idea that there's more to it being intergenerational and a direct attack on myself as well. Something that took very long for me to process, and I don't think I've processed it yet, is just identity. Growing up, I was born in the year 2000, growing up in a Western society where there's such great internal conflicts between how I'm told to live my spiritual practices and the effects of Western media and external influences, and just being able to say, this is who I am, and I don't care if society accepts me as who I am. I can confidently say that I haven't figured that out yet. And when it comes to the idea that my very own identity is what was being attacked in 84, that truly makes it much more difficult, because I can't really relate with a whole nation that has attacked my identity. And it makes it so much harder just because I haven't truly realized my own identity yet.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, I'll just go around and try to have all of you answer the same question. We'll just do this with a couple questions before we start taking the ones that we've got from Instagram and from the chat. And if there's a certain question where you feel like you need to pass, that's not a problem at all. And I think that one of the things that, you know, I feel like we've made so much progress in this area because it's been so much progress from the time that I was 9, 10, or 15 or 16 years old, that I feel like things are really moving in a direction where there is broader understanding, broader recognition, a willingness to learn, a willingness to make sure the Sikh voices are heard. That sometimes it surprises me that this story is not as broadly understood and accepted by the Sikh diaspora as you would think by this time. So I guess the question, again, going around in that circle, is how do we do that then? How do we get to sort of this indisputable, it's horrific to suggest anything other than what happened was a massacre and a genocide? How do we get to the point where, you know, we're not rattled by the number of people willing to say it didn't happen, or it wasn't as bad as you think, or it wasn't as bad as you said? So how do we get to that point where the genocide, the understanding of it, the massacre, the events that have come since are an understanding instead of a story up for dispute and up to interpretation? Guntaas, I'll start with you.
I think it's a question that probably each one of us on the panel has struggled with and have questioned and railed against brick walls to figure out for ourselves. And the question is, the answer, I don't think there's one answer to it. I hope, if I can put it that way, my hope is that more panels like this, more conversation, more cross-generational conversation can lift the veil on the doubt internal across the community. I think we as a community have to come together and understand that, and really, if I can put, really come to terms with our history and acknowledge it amongst ourselves. And you're right, there is so much more available in terms of resources, in terms of firsthand accounts of people being willing to come forward and tell their experiences of 1984. Personally, we saw a little bit of that last year on a panel with survivors from inside the Darbar Sahib. And I think time gives people the opportunity to do that. I won't say about time, heals all wounds, but more so time gives you time, that buffer you need to process what you've gone through. And as a community, it gives us time to be willing to hear each other, to maybe understand as we experience others' traumas, others, other communities. When we look at our Indigenous sisters and brothers and their experiences recently with, ground penetrating radar telling us that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of graves of unidentified children, it brings it home because it's in our backyards. So I think it's the same thing within the Sikh community. When we look at the Armenian community, they have fought for decades to have their genocide recognized. It's those. We look to examples of how other communities have handled it and approached it and come together. So I think it's internally coming together. My apologies for the background noise, but and being willing to listen to one another and lift the doubt and perhaps see a new or understand history in a new way, amongst ourselves. Acknowledge, like Paramvir Singh said, that even our parents sometimes have tried to shield us, but shielding us only makes the questions that much bigger and their impact, the answers that much more, they resonate and they strike us anew in a more powerful way. So I don't think there's one way, but I definitely think there are steps we can take to start as a community, acknowledging what we've experienced firsthand and then across our generations and go from there.
Hey, Amneet?
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, it's a question about truth telling and narrative correction and what really happened. Like, what is it that we are confronting? What is it that we are experiencing, etc. And so I'm gonna kind of put on my academic hat for a second, and I see it as two really ways. One is legal, the legal remedies of like the legal fact finding of things, and then the other one is kind of the trauma based approach of reconciliation and healing. And I want to share a quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes of all time. I use it all the time in everything that I do, and it's from a woman named Dr. Judith Herman, and she's written a book where basically she draws an analogy between state terror and domestic terror. So she talks about the experiences of a domestic abuse victim or survivor and someone that is going through something similar with state terror. And she said it's not all that different when you're looking at it from healing and reconciliation perspective. So I want to just quickly read the quote and then I'll get into kind of my analysis. She says that secrecy and silence are the perpetrator's first line of defense. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the credibility of his victim. If he cannot silence her absolutely, he tries to make sure that no one listens. To this end, he marshals an impressive array of arguments, from the most blatant denial to the most sophisticated and elegant rationalization. After every atrocity, one can expect to hear the same predictable apologies. It never happened. The victim lies. The victim exaggerates. The victim brought this upon herself. In any case, it's time to forget and move on. So quite a powerful quote. And I think it applies almost, for me, like a cookie cutter into what's happened to the Sikh community, right? Like, let's deny what happened in 1984. There's something called the propaganda tapes that were sent out by the Indian state to diaspora communities to say nothing happened, everything's good and fine here. They kicked out the media, right? Then it was like when the truth started to come out, then it was like, they're exaggerating. It wasn't that bad. These were a bunch of terrorists. We never killed any innocent people. Then when the truth came out about that, then it was like, well, they brought this upon themselves. They're a bunch of terrorists. And then it's, let's not talk about the past, let's move on, right? Like, let's not bring up these old memories. I think we've all heard that. And so for the Sikh community, I think particularly in the diaspora, there's this desire, I mean, I would think for Sikhs generally, and anyone that is human rights and social justice oriented, is a desire for the truth. Because to come to the truth gives us the ability to reconcile and find a path forward. So from a legal perspective, I'll quickly I'll try to be not super nerdy about this, but there's something called customary law in international law. There are basic fundamental principles of law that no country can say, oh, we don't have that in our domestic legislation. Like, our country doesn't believe in that. Things like murder. Like, you can't say murder is allowed in our country. Murder is not allowed, right? And under customary law, we have these ideas of the duty to investigate. So every country and nation is obligated to investigate when something happens. And in that investigation, there's a right to remedy, right? So if something has happened, a right to impartial, thorough investigation of what took place. And for every single day that doesn't happen, that there's not a process moving towards truth, in law, we say that's another violation of law. And then there's also the right to humane treatment. So I think of what my brother Paramvir Singh said, is that for the families that have lost someone, the families that are waiting for truth, every day that they get there's a lack of access to that justice and information is another violation of rights. Then there's obviously genocide and murder and disappearance, and something called command responsibility. So the prime minister of a nation, India, for example, can't say, oh, well, I'm not responsible, because they now are informed. They know these things are happening, or these things were taking place, and they willfully neglected or looked the other way when the entire international community, like Paneet Singh said earlier, was witnessing it from Canada, right? Like, there was news stories. And so that's kind of the law aspect of it, is saying we need to investigate this. We need the truth as to what happened. Now, from a trauma-informed perspective, from the perspective of the Sikh diaspora, from the Sikh community, there's this idea of transitional justice. There's two competing narratives, right? There's the narrative of the Indian state, kind of going back to the quote that I said, that said, these people were terrorists. They deserved what they got. And, even if something happened that we didn't intend to happen, it happened so long ago, let's move on, right? And maybe we can get into a little bit later on how they kind of employ that practice. But from the Sikh perspective, there's a desire for truth-telling and narrative correction. And I see a lot of that happening in the diaspora through the arts, really, like a strong desire to do that. And, Paneet Singh is an example. Sikh Activist Network was a good example. Rupi Kaur is a phenomenal example. Political leaders from our community that are speaking out are an example. And I think the only way we get to the truth is if we actually have trials and truth commissions. And first we need to have a truth commission as to what happened. So a non-legal remedy, inquiry into facts of relevant authorities, opportunity for victims to come forward and share their stories without fear, and then a formal finding of facts, and then trials. In those trials, the judiciary and the legal system in India is so far gone on this issue that there needs to be international participation in it. And so I think, this idea of what is the truth, et cetera, I think we're all struggling with it because, a very powerful entity and a state has effectively tried to cover up the truth and has prevented international human rights organizations and NGOs and anyone else from gaining that truth. So we're left questioning ourselves, being like, how many people were actually murdered? How many people were killed? Where were they killed? How were they killed? And there's been an opportunity, there's been an attempt by the state to stop that every step along the way. So I think truth-telling and narrative correction is something that is profoundly centered to what the diaspora communities are doing. And obviously we're challenged in that, but I still don't think we know the truth. I think it could be much worse than what we believed it to be, right? So I think that's a part of the dilemma here.
Paneet, there you are. You just changed position on my screen. Over to you.
I mean, I have very little to add beyond the scope of Guntaas, Kaur, and Amneet Singh, in terms of the social commentary on it, the legal commentary on it. I think it was extremely, like, was you guys really did an amazing job of that. What I will say is, I mean, I spend a lot of time, and I ask for grace for my candor, because it's like, this is very anecdotal, but I mean, by virtue of the work that I've been able to do, been fortunate to do, which is, it's community-based, it's community-informed. I get to sit and talk to a lot of people, read a lot of memoirs, and it's very like human-centric, where it's not always a textbook, it's not always an academic source. It is a lot of the time, at least in the beginning, that where things start from, but it becomes human-centric after that. And the investigation starts to really happen when you start connecting with the hearts and the souls of the people who experience things, again, whether it was like satellite here, people who experience living through that, going to school every day, knowing what was happening in India, or people who are inside of the Darbar Sahib. So, I mean, I look to the work that people like Satnam Singh Bance and folks are doing in terms of the legal pursuit of justice for folks who are targeted through the Delhi pogroms. And there's a lot of great example of that out there. One thing that I will say is the thing that where I have a pretty strong belief in progressive politics and just government structures. Anecdotally, I also have a strong belief that human beings will always be fallible. And that is going to be at the crux of a lot of it. And when you start investigating the human element of not just 84 and not just the killing side of the genocide, but also the movement and the insurgency, like on all sides, you're going to see human fallacy, and you start seeing, like, if only this person didn't do X, if only this person didn't do Y, if only this person didn't do Z. So with an enthusiastic and resounding yes to everything Guntaas, Kaur, and Amneet Singh said, with that caveat, I also want to say that, and I'm saying this specifically speaking to a Sikh audience, that there's always two prongs to this. And that prong is the political and the spiritual. And if we want to carry this work forward, this work of truth telling, we want to make ourselves as truthful and whole as human beings as possible. We want to make ourselves as spiritually robust as possible. We want to make ourselves as guru-centric as possible. Then investigating things takes on a new lens and a secondary meaning. And I'll call back to, and like, Amneet Singh probably thinks back to his MSN days. I was probably like one of several people he's talking to. I mean, for me, he was like an older person, like I was talking to, I got, had more experience than me. And he said something to me that stuck with me for my whole life. And I'll share it here. It's because there was this thing, something blew up on Facebook because there was a bunch of toxic masculinity on Facebook and young men just going at each other about different aspects of the movement in Chirasi and Punjab politics. And we had a conversation on MSN on the side where we started talking about this idea of saintliness. And we were talking about other people like Malcolm X and other leaders as well. And I said, I was like, but the thing is that I can't compare someone like Sanjay Singh to any other activist because of the fact that I treat him to be a Gurmukh, right? That's how I think of him as. And Amneet Singh responded, he said, that's fair or something like that. He acknowledged what I said, but he said to me, the part of him about being a Gurmukh and a Sant and a spiritual figure isn't divorced from the politics of it, isn't divorced from his political activism. It's another layer of it. And that's where I think our next steps forward have to be, is that there was a lot of politicizing and political action over the last 40 years. There has been, and there will continue to be. Once we start interrogating our institutions with a lens of gurmat, with a lens of qualities taught to us as Sikhs by our gurus, guru given qualities of sat, santok, daya, dharm, tiraj, of truth, peace, righteousness, compassion, and I forgot what tiraj means, or the English equivalent anyway, but we'll stop there. But I think that's the next element of this is reimagining what our political action can be from a Sikh perspective as Sikhs internally, with a spiritual revolution.
And Paramvir, you're next. And just to level set again, I guess the question, and because you'll approach it from a different perspective than me or Guntaas or Amneet or Paneet, we're all coming from different places on this, but what do you think it will take to sort of get a broader sort of undisputed understanding of the facts and like ownership of the facts around 1984, instead of this constant, kind of like what you talked about, this sort of blurring of the whole thing or not fully acknowledging what happened? What will it take, do you think, to get to that place?
First off, I'd like to thank Amneet Singh and Paneet Singh for like a truly articulate idea and thoughts, and sharing their thoughts on what needs to be done on a political level and how the politics of it really ties into the spiritual aspect of it. But what I would like to talk about more is addressing the trauma and the healing process on a smaller scale, on just getting the discussion started within your local groups, within your friends, and just being comfortable talking about an idea. Because yes, the Indian government and outside sources might just tell us to forget about it. It's 30 years in the past, heal and move on. Which, from an outside perspective, to some might make sense. But in my defense, you can only heal and forget about something if it's not affecting you anymore. But in just recent news, when people, activists such as Jaggi, are talking about that idea, they're being detained, they're being arrested, they're being tortured, which is in the 2010s, also 30 years after. So a lot of the fear stems from the idea that if I talk about this, what's going to happen to me? Am I better off forgetting about it, letting the trauma stay there and just not talking about it? And on the other sense, I'm a strong believer of the idea that healing is only possible when you truly address an issue and you express your vulnerability. So to be able to share your vulnerability, not only with your community and also with others, is what I feel like will get the attention of others and make them understand why we want them to understand on how strongly we feel about this. And there is also a fine line, quite a fine line that's indescribable, between being vulnerable and being seen as a victim. I'm also a strong believer of the fact that justice cannot be served if we place ourselves in the victim mindset all the time. We need to be able to express our vulnerability while still recognizing our strengths and recognizing how far we've come as the diaspora, recognizing that although our community in its core and its identity was struck with an actual genocide, we've still been able to thrive in Western societies and also still heal and recover to a certain extent in India and across the globe, while our identity is still thriving.
Thank you. I was actually speaking to a woman who does quite a bit of work in the Indigenous space. And while we've been having these discussions about the 215 bodies in Kamloops, and now we're talking about, other parts of the country, 700 plus just outside of Regina, and many more that the Indigenous community has known for generations. This is not news to them. And it's not news to people who have made the time to understand Indigenous history, But for many people, it's like, I just never knew. I had no idea, I never knew, which seems like it's unforgivable. Like, to me, it feels a little unforgivable, just because how could you not know? And one of Corey's questions, and it was a great question, I thought, was, what narrative then, what story did you tell yourself about us when you saw the overrepresentation in the downtown east side, when you saw the overrepresentation that's going on for decades now in the criminal justice system, when you heard the news and just decided you probably couldn't do anything about it when it came to the boil water advisories or the suicide rates amongst our very youngest children on reserves around this country. So what was that story that allowed you to kind of go, that's happening, I guess we must move on? So, and I'm not trying to make any equivalencies here, but I guess I sometimes look to what's happened in the diaspora community. I look at, what happened with some people who settled here in the 60s and the 70s and in the 80s, and a certain degree of breakdown in those families, high rates of alcoholism, high rates of, or I'm not going to say high rates of alcoholism because I can't compare. I don't have the numbers and the statistics to actually back that up. But experiences of maybe alcoholism or the use of substances that just didn't make sense or were disruptive to families. And then I think when you start looking back and you start looking at 1947, and then you start looking at, the sense of, I can only imagine helplessness, amongst people like in my family and others around the 1980s and in the 90s as things continued, and, you feel like there's nothing you can do. What do you think? And I'll start with Guntaas again. What do you think the impact is there? How does that impact us? What happens when you are having experiences, they're due to something. They don't just rise in isolation. There are these impacts that you're dealing with in real time that are happening right now that you maybe never thought to connect back to different events. Thoughts on that, perspective on what it takes to tell the truth and recover, or maybe even just tell the truth and link back some of the things that are happening today. So I guess we're talking about intergenerational trauma here, just to be a little bit more precise. But can we talk about that and how that we've seen that sort of affect people around us in the community?
Thank you for the hot seat again. But no, great question. And I think I'm taken aback by all the responses and I think the input and the sharing of different experiences, with fundamentally great pieces coming from everyone on the panel. When I look at this, I think I look back at my own journey with it, because I think that is one of these pieces that we see often when it comes to intergenerational trauma. And it does tie to some extent with also my learning of Indigenous history in Canada, particularly within residential schools and the genocide they experienced. When I looked at 84 and started to ask questions, it struck me that we'd never discussed it as a family. You had the odd question about 1984. I heard something in school today about Golden Temple attack, and you got an answer. I am grateful for my parents that they always answered the question, but there was a piece to the question or the answer that was, okay, that's it. We've answered it. We're gonna leave it there. When I really started to dig into this, and that was kind of, my journey led me to a master's degree in the topic, or writing, as part of my master's program. I think it was the silence around it that really struck me, that in a family that talked about pretty much anything and everything. And we had a rule, actually, it was not even a rule, but more so an approach that if we didn't know the answer when it came to wearing at the start or Sikhi in general, that if you didn't know something, ask. And if we don't know it, we'll go looking together with you. You know, that was the approach that my parents took. And it largely stemmed from me starting to wear at the start as a young woman. And it translated into my journey with 1984 that I couldn't understand attending a vigil and then these pictures and finding out my parents were at the rallies in 84, you know, in June as diaspora members, that this is something that just didn't come up. And so that is, if I look now at it, it's an intergenerational trauma. They were a first generation to experience it outside of home. What that must have felt like, I can't imagine. You're trying to get news out of Punjab, you're trying to find out if family's affected by it. And it's something that hopefully it's still part of my journey to explore that with my parents, with other family members, and really dig into that. But I can say that starting to talk about it helped. You know, me starting to ask questions, me starting to look at resources, really lifted the veil of silence, as Amneet Singh mentioned, this kind of truth-telling journey that I went on. And I now, in the lead up to this webinar, I thought, I wonder if part of it was a fear of being judged as parents, not as parents, but as Sikhs from Punjab, from India, maybe perhaps even understanding, you know, the questions around why Jarnail Singh Ji was inside the Darbar Sahib, all of those pieces, because we are children born and raised in Western societies. We understand human rights and justice and law and, you know, just war theory a certain way, largely and mostly informed by Western, you know, if you want to say democracies or Western society, and what is correct and incorrect. And so it struck me this week in the lead up that I wonder if an element of it was that they were afraid of being judged by their own children, that if they understood it, we would, you know, that narrative that was running through, particularly in BC, of you know, fundamentalists and moderates and extremists, and that their own children would start to frame them that way. But I think the biggest thing that exploring 1984 challenges in a person is that you shatter lenses that you look at information through. You start to put, you know, understanding us, like Paneet Singh said, a Gurmat Gurbani Sikhi inspired lens on history, on Sikh history, on those pieces. And you start to say, okay, I might be able to look at this from the truth-telling, truth and reconciliation element that we see out of South Africa, we've experienced here in Canada, but I also need to understand this from a Sikhi lens, and from me as a Sikh place myself in that story. And I think what it led to was we as a family started to explore it. I remember my parents, you know, ordering journals from Punjab or from Kolkata for me to go through, 20 years of them. And they started to look at it in a whole new way and understand it as, from the way Amneet Singh highlighted, on an international law perspective, on a legal framework, on you know, a sociology, anthropology. So if I can say, one of the reactions and where we see it in terms of behavior that I can probably say I experienced growing up was that model minority aspect, right? That we were a minority in Punjab or in India, not Punjab, sorry, in India. And there was a reaction to when we started to even call out the greater system on its own failings, right? And you were harshly reacted to with secessionist claims and extremists and terrorism. It's the same. I look at, I do see that in our communities, whether we're in the UK, we're in the US, we're in Canada, we're elsewhere. When you look up the terms of intergenerational trauma and the definitions, you also see in there beliefs and behaviors. It's not just trauma as in pain and, depression and anxiety, but it's also you start to model certain behaviors. And an element of that, I wonder, because it's such a new area of study, is could the model minority behavior fall under that we need to be model Sikhs, we need to be the model neighbor. We take our Sikhi and inspire it to be the compassionate, the giving, which are all wonderful things, and those are principles that are entrenched in us. But was an element of that a reaction to what we faced and what we experienced in '84, that we were, and also the silencing of it, right? When we tried to talk about, our parents probably didn't even have the words to explain it to their neighbors and their coworkers, that they just kind of internalized it and left it. But when they did start to try and explain it, they might have felt pushback because of what, when we look at Air India, or we look at, other things that the community got labeled with. And so it was, okay, how do we correct that? And let's be the model Canadian, the model American, that we can be, and still be Sikh and feel like we haven't compromised that element of our lives.
I feel like that could be a big discussion on its own, is feeling this sense of responsibility or the burden to correct something like that, or feeling, some sense of responsibility to correct that. That's feel like we could do another one on that, but a very good point. Does anybody else want to react to that? Because if not, I do have some other questions that I'd like to just throw at you. And if you decide that there's a question that I pitched out to maybe another panelist that you'd like to answer, please throw your hand up. But there's just one in the chat right now. There are a couple of other Instagram ones that I'd like to ask, but maybe I'll start with this one with Paneet, because you've already spoken to this a little bit, but could you talk about how propaganda-induced internal conflict has affected Sikhs in the diaspora spiritually?
I could get on a soapbox and talk about this for a long time. Yeah. Oh, okay. Hold on. I have so many things to say. They're all fighting each other. It's like that episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns has too many diseases and they're trying to squish it through that model door. And so they're all stuck. I think the propaganda-induced internal conflict is a great aspect, and like something that's probably at the heart of a lot of it. And I mean, when it comes to like that spiritual, oh man, okay. So I'm really trying to collect myself.
Take your time.
I think there's a really easy approach to call for unity. And this isn't any kind of judgment on the question asker. I don't know who asked it, and I'm not assuming anything about their political stances or beliefs or practices. But it's really easy to see differences of opinions, differences in political approach, legal strategy, social values, to be fueled exclusively by propaganda and state-sponsored interest and infiltration and espionage. I think there's, especially here on the West Coast, we know all too well how robust the state espionage was from the Indian government. That being said, I think it only worked because of the fact that there was already like it was existing factions that were being pitted against each other, right? And this is where like I kind of have an issue with trying to take a pan-diasporic approach to '84, because I don't think there is a way to qualify any, like, all the experiences of one experience. I can speak to the West Coast experience because I'm a nerd about local Sikh history, and it's like the issues that we have now have gone back to the Ghadar movement, have gone back to 1906, right? Akali Singh and Rostri Gurdwaras, if you're familiar, were to build Gurdwara not exclusively because the community was growing in the 1950s and needed two spaces, but also because of an inherent difference in the way that their spiritual identities progressed, right? And what they identified with. In 1952, Akali Singh split from Rostri because they didn't agree with some of the practices that Khalsa Diwan Society was doing. It's that simple. Before that, like the Ghadar movement, like there was espionage from the British for sure, and infiltration into the Ghadar movement here on the West Coast. But at the exact same time, there were plenty of Sikhs who were former soldiers that were British loyalists. Like it wasn't any one way. And I think that has existed throughout the decades, and it exists now, and it will continue to exist forever, because we will never be a uniform group. That's not the way that the Panth has ever been, in my opinion. Unity and uniformity are not interchangeable. That being said, I think those fault lines that have been existing in the community for the last century and for the last however long were exacerbated and exploited by the Indian state and used to pit people against each other. They were used to galvanize support. Bodies of intelligence use those factions to get people to report on one another, to snitch, all those things, to persecute. Spiritually, I think there's an aspect of Sikhi that can speak to this, which is Vivek Buddhi. Vivek Buddhi means to have like a discerning intellect. It's to be able to see right from wrong, from intention to action. It's the ability to separate what you might want to happen and what is actually happening, right? I mean, this is easier said than done, but I think a part of this is also how we interpret the Khalsa Sikh identity, especially post 84, where the Khalsa Sikh identity became very, very much entrenched in the insurgency, right? Those were the contemporary visuals of martyrdom that you had were the Baba Deep Singhs were now the Baba Tara Singhs, right? That's who was adorning the walls of the Gurdwara, which is not a bad thing at all. But what I do think might have happened, again, very anecdotally speaking, what I do think might have happened is in the bravado of action and armed conflict, that the Khalsa Sikh identity has not just been one of like blind like aggression, right? There is an inherent vulnerability and compassion within our martial structures, within our political structures, and the way that, like what I said last time, the way these all speak to each other. So I mean, I'm on 17 different tangents. I'll try to wrap it up in this one thought, is that I think the collective spirituality of the Sikh community was affected by 84, both by propaganda and by like our own unresolved emotions and trauma and all of those things. And I think moving forward from here, the way we rehabilitate and investigate and interrogate and grow that sense of spirituality individually and as a community is by revisiting our traditions and our beliefs and ethos as Khalsa Sikhs and as Sikhs at large. Because I do think, again, in the spectrum of experience in Sikhi, like we need to be open to all the diversity that exists in what being a Sikh is. And that starts at Vivek Buddhi, and that starts with the Guru-centered practice, that starts with a Shabd-centered practice, in my belief. There's a lot of words for all of you.
A lot of good words. Thank you very much. I have another question, and I think this is one, it's just a little bit off of what, it doesn't actually build off what you were saying, but I think it's still a really important one, is with the farmers' protest and everything that was happening, and Sikhs sort of being visible and fearlessly in the lead in that movement, and then joined by so many others who also then were able to sort of fearlessly lead their community in solidarity. And we see the movement now and what it has been and what it's become and how it's gained worldwide attention. I would be lying if I didn't say I worried that there was going to be another massacre. I saw some of the tweets coming from pretty well-placed, as far as the system goes in India, individuals actually calling for this and warning Sikhs in no uncertain terms, very publicly. Do you remember 1984? Not even a veiled threat, but just a very clear threat that you people are due for another massacre. So the question, and this comes from Instagram, is, do you think, and of course it's speculation, you don't have a crystal ball, you can't answer this definitively, so Amneet, I'll just send it over to you. Do you fear, so I won't say what you think, but do you fear that a Sikh genocide could happen again in India?
Yeah, I mean that's a loaded question, and I'll take a step back and I would say I think there are close to, if not genocides, occurring in India right now, right? Like I think let's zoom out and not just focus on the Sikh community, because from a Sikh-centric perspective, it's really the humanity and compassion of all living things. And I think we look at the treatment of Muslims. My family comes from Kashmir, right? Like we look at the treatment of Muslims, members of the Dalit community, etc. Like I could go on and on and on. Do I fear it? Yes. And this might sound quite bizarre, but I think the current situation and the current mechanics of things scare me. I think they are far worse than they were in 1984. And I'm gonna explain this. So I did a master's in law, and one of those things I kind of looked at, ideology, narrative, etc., and why Sikhs have been framed as what's a state narrative and why, right? And so, and I really looked at ideology, language, and power. And I found some really good literature from a Hindu woman who wrote about this. Can't remember the book, etc. But she really broke down the rise of extreme right-wing Hindu nationalism in India, and is almost prophetic because it was written before the rise of Modi. And she broke it down this way. She basically, and we've seen this happen in many countries across the world, I think. So, this is why it worries me. So the ideological positionality of India right now is that these are not my thoughts. These are the thoughts of this woman, and I share them. So don't want to take credit for it. But she was like, look, in the most simplistic way to look at it, India is being revisioned and reimagined and rebranded as Hindustan or Bharat Mata, right? Bharat Mata is a Hindu goddess. India's identity is intrinsically connected to religious belief. The defense of India is the defense of God, a goddess, and the defense of Hinduism. Therefore, the questioning of India is an attack on Hindus and Hinduism, and ultimately an attack on God. Now, if you look at the current predicament in India right now, there's an additional layer, which is the BJP, Modi, and their brand of like militant, violent Hindu nationalism, the RSS, etc. So now if you critique Modi, who is basically the brand of what India is, you're critiquing Bharat Mata, which means you're critiquing the Hindu goddess, which means you're attacking the religious belief of India, and you're attacking God, effectively, right? So the space for dissent, the space for questioning of things, the space for dialogue even, is almost been eliminated. And so that scares me. And so I want to take it one step further. So that's kind of the ideological, I think, this woman in her words. Now let's look at the political discourse. The political discourse is that we have a constitution in India where I believe Article 25, Section 2B says Hindus equal Sikh, Jain, Buddhist. The underlying message of that is Hindus do not equal Muslims or Christians or Jewish folks. So anyone that is Abrahamic is immediately on the peripheries or seen as a threat, particularly I would say the Muslim community. Sikhs fall within a really peculiar position because they either accept and be co-opted into this idea that they belong to this Hindu nationalist movement, this right-wing movement, or they're traitors. So now we have a situation in India where if you question, so if you're a non-Hindu, if you belong to the Abrahamic faith, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, etc., you are immediately put on the peripheries. You are immediately an outcast. And particularly if you're a Muslim, you are a threat and you are an enemy, right? If you are Jain, Buddhist, or Sikh and don't prescribe to this idea that you are Hindu, then you are a traitor. And what are the consequences of that? We've already seen it. We saw what happened in Gujarat. We see we see like literally lynchings happening of members of the Muslim community. And so in your question of like, do I fear where India's at right now? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like the stage has been set for the justification of massacres, because they've already occurred, and massacre by justifying it through the lens of God or goddesses or gods. And that is a very, very dangerous thing. And so am I fearful or am I worried? I mean, fear, I mean, from a Sikh lens perspective, maybe not fear, but am I concerned? Absolutely, absolutely. Because I think the stage has been set for something quite dangerous. I hope that answers the question.
It does. And I wonder if, because I think immediately during the farmers' protest and that whole struggle, one of the things that I noticed with diaspora communities and the work of Poetic Justice Foundation and many others was a very specific call to action around getting as much information out into other parts of the world as quickly as possible, with a very sort of very attuned to making sure that the story that was being told was as balanced and accurate as possible. Do you think that could possibly make the difference going forward? Is that in the 1980s, you know, I think about the tools we had available as newer communities and newer citizens of all these different countries, and how what we have now, the abilities we have now, it's different. We're still dealing with a lot of barriers to getting information out. It's not that hard to clamp down on good information and make it disappear from, you know, from like social platforms and channels and stuff like that, or to counter it with a huge amount of disinformation. So that is obviously still there. But does it give you some hope that the sort of like the media ecosystem, I suppose, that we're in right now will hopefully make it that much harder to sort of like shroud everything in secrecy if it's happening on the ground?
Yeah, so yes, the short answer is yes. And I think there's a couple things I want to mention. The first thing I think we have to acknowledge is a solidarity and actions and strength and resilience, because we've been speaking a lot from positions of vulnerability, the strength and resilience of people on the ground, right? Like I think the farmer protest there was something quite beautiful in that, because Sikhs and non-Sikhs, Punjabis and non-Punjabis, people of all walks and backgrounds came together and said, don't try to paint this as something that it's not, right? And even if people hold those views, you know, hold certain views, whether it's around Khalistan or separatism, etc., they're allowed to hold those views, right? But this is, you know, like, stop trying to demonize people for holding a peaceful perspective on something, for having a thought. Stop trying to criminalize thought. Now something interesting has happened. India for a long time was made in the image of Gandhi, right? Now, what are the connotations of that? Pacifists, peaceful, etc. So when 1984 happened, India was made in the image of Gandhi, and it was the perspective of Western countries was like, this is a country where you go to where there's markets filled with colorful spices, people are doing yoga, and they're super peaceful, etc. Right? That was not our lived reality. That was not our lived experiences as people that belong to that land, but that was a perception. Ironically, India is being remade into the image of Modi today, right? And I think if you pay attention to the New York Times Washington Post, etc. I think they recognize that there's something dangerous about this man, right? This nationalism that is occurring, this right-wing nationalism. And so I think that brings me some hope. I think you know, the cliche thing to say is the internet and social media and all those sort of things, and that is all true. But I think in addition to that, the alignment, and when we look at geopolitics of India aligning with the far right extreme of the world, I think that has opened people's eyes to what is going on there for sure. So it brings me some hope. I think the media took a while for them to realize, and I think they're slowly still realizing. And I think there's still many challenges for sure. But in 1984, Rupi Kaur would not have gotten an op-ed into the Washington Post. That would have not have existed. There would have been no Jagmeet Singh to get up and speak. There would have been, you know, no Preet Kaur Gills in the UK legislature to get up and speak. And so the world has changed in many ways for sure. And I think that has a profound impact on the way things occur. Like Rihanna would not have tweeted about us in 1984, right? Like I think those things all happen because there's a chain of events where the community has done some instrumental work.
Paramvir, this next question is for you, and also comes to us from Instagram, or I believe the chat. So the vigils had sort of higher attendance for a period of time. It seems like all that attendance should be growing. It's not as much as, you know, people who've been attending would like. How do we engage, especially when it comes to young people? How do we engage younger people? What are some of the best ways to engage wider audiences to help show support and really kind of commemorate this event? What do you think?
One of the biggest struggles is in holding like such events right now is, I believe, just the pandemic. So there is like everybody would love if the vigil could be just massive with attendances of 500,000 people. But there is a fear. So what we noticed is that a lot of people were saying that they do want to attend, but they won't be due to COVID. So this isn't just like a one-time thing. This is multiple people. So that being said, for future years coming up, how do we bring people together? So one of the main things is just getting the conversation started and showing that this isn't something that's considered taboo to talk about. And an interesting thing that's really struck with me was the conversation I was having with Paneet Singh, because I feel like when I'm talking about 84, in my mind, there is really a defensive spirit where I'm really trying to justify everything to an extreme extent and just find a perfect answer. Like, look, this is who we are. We didn't do anything and we're being labeled as extremists. So justifying that is already putting us in a defensive mindset. And we're trying to really show others that this is perfect. But what I would really love to happen is if we can be more vulnerable and just open and be able to show or be able to grieve with the general public. So this year, like with the vigil, what I really loved is that, yes, it was oriented on 84 and the Sikh genocide, but the indigenous community, the Palestinian community all came together to recognize that human rights issues are really a global issue. And yes, there is a bias that we're gonna be exploring the griefs of our own people, but it's also equally important for a collective grieving. And correlating this to an earlier question on intergenerational trauma, what I strongly believe is that when our generation, and more so our parents' generation, when they're talking about something that happens, let's say in a different community, let's say the Black community faced years, centuries of oppression. How did we look upon that issue? We say, oh, it happened, and then we don't really know how to react. Yes, we'll talk about it sometimes and say that it's terrible, no one should have to face this. But when we place ourselves in the same shoes and we really try to serve justice, we didn't really know how to react. What do we do? Because years ago in 47, when Punjab was split, that generation didn't really tackle any of the trauma. And our parents' generation, grandparents' generation, that trauma was placed upon them with no way to talk about it. And let's say for Sikhs that were in the diaspora, like Guntaas mentioned, they didn't really even have the vocabulary to talk about it. So if you're a Sikh in the 80s and 90s and you're working amongst your peers, even to this date, we don't know how to talk about it with people that don't know much about the issue. So how would they have been able to talk about it? And when we don't really know how to seek justice in other people's shoes, and when we're placing ourselves in the target being attacked, there was quite the difficulty of not being able to know what to do about this issue. So now, just attending and helping organize the vigil was such a liberating experience to be able to connect with not only our own community but with other communities. And I really hope for upcoming years, I hope the turnout keeps continuing to grow and we can really get the word out to others and be able to share not only the truth of what happened, what we perceive to be true, but also be able to express our vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Guntaas, when we were just sort of briefing before the session, just prior to the session, we just talked about the different perspectives that people are coming from when it comes to their understanding of 1984. And one of the ones we didn't get to unpack was the one that, not the one that I came from, but the one that was sort of fed to me when I was just a kid. And I just remember, the role that were happening. I remember like a lot of frantic conversations, or frantic trying to place calls to India with my family. And I remember how angry my dad was because he was an anti-Khalistani. And he felt that, the community brought this upon ourselves. He talked about the assassination and he talked about, just all these different reasons why, we just deserved it. And I think it troubled me later because it took me a long time to kind of understand and maybe separate my dad's feelings about this whole event and how they'd been passed down to me and my feelings, which were completely different and distinct as I was leaning into them and learning more about my community and learning more about my own history and just kind of taking that upon myself and Sikh and putting myself on that. And that was my own thing, just kind of getting myself into that space. And just the damage that must have done. Because clearly we expect people outside the community to buy that version of events. But a lot of people in our community also took ownership of those as sort of like accepted facts. And this is just how it went. So there was a real distancing by people from Sikh, especially precisely when they probably needed to just be able to unpack events, understand them better, and show up. So what do you think the impact of that has been? How difficult do you think it is to continue to try to almost like right that ship? Because for me, it's been exhausting. Just dealing with people within our own community who just kind of like went, yeah, this happened, put it in this box, forget about it. It was our community's fault that these things happened, because that's just an easier course of action for them. I've seen things pivot completely. I feel like there's been a real 180. So what do you think it's going to take to really just kind of internally continue that education? I feel like I keep on coming back to the same question, but I feel like there's certain segments where the progress is being made, in certain areas where the progress is being made. I remember looking at Jagmeet and thinking, oh, he said that. It's been said. It is in the, it's out in the world now. But the courage it must have and for maybe Jagmeet, not so much, because, you know, there's some people who can just say what needs to be said because they're fearless about it. But anyhow, I guess the question is, with all this conversation that we're having, what does it take to sort of like right that ship amongst people, especially who just will not be willing to have that discussion because they were fed a certain narrative and they fully bought into it, and it's not seeming to change.
I almost, it seems like it's the theme of today's today's panel, but it's also actually that very question is what inspired today's event, because we were within the WSO, we were hearing about this from within our own team members, our own regional members, our own national board members, that there is still this, there's an element of our community that has always grown up feeling like they can talk about it. And there's an element, there's a portion of our community that feels that once they started, they could, and it wasn't, you know, they were unafraid, or they weren't hesitant to start discussing it. And then there remains this element that is hush hush about it. They don't know how else to be, because it's not things or topics when we're talking about, and it can be, to some, it could be terminology, you know, when we're talking about genocide versus riot or pogrom, or we talk about nationalism or Sikh extremism, or, you know, Khalistan, all of these can seem as terms, and to some they're very heavy hitting, and others they are part and parcel of the conversation. And, you know, in this age of, when we look at, you know, independence movements, whether it's in South Sudan or Kosovo, or, you know, so many other places, Palestine comes to mind, you're struck with, it's part of the conversation. As Amneet Singh said, that, you know, this asking why, of dissenting opinions, of questioning the structures that be, or the status quo, can seem, at least the feedback we were getting for a lot, it seems taboo. And I think, you know, Rena, as you've mentioned, you can attest to this, the 180, Paneet Singh, Amneet Singh, myself, from where we started looking into this topic and exploring it and learning about it, whether we were 16 at a vigil or 11, or we were at the Gurdwara, or in you know, Rena, in your case, that it was denied completely, or said that this was, you know, we were asking for it. We can see the progress we've made as a community. We can attest to it. We perhaps even are part of it. But why do we still have this, I think, is this question? Why do we still have this cycle where there is a portion of our community that that truth telling, or that understanding hasn't reached yet, and there are people that you can't talk to? I see a glimmer. I think the Kisan, the movement, really brought to light, and you see it, the messages that you get on Instagram. I get it from high school friends, from people I never would have expected to hear, you know, and this isn't any kind of criticism on them, but, you know, they would recognize themselves as being Sikh and not Sikh. That, you know, they see themselves largely as Punjabi Sikh in Canada or in the US, and now we're flooding each other with messages on India's approach to this aspect. And I think there's a bit of an awakening happening there, and a willingness to hear, and organizations with track records that are challenging on not just advocacy, but you know, you look at INSAF, you look at Sikh Coalition, you look at WSO, you look at you know, a plethora of organizations across the globe that are Khalsa Aid, that are highlighting Sikhi in a way that I think people haven't interacted with. There is this sense within each of us that we want to explore our own heritage. You know, if people are exploring their heritage everywhere, and exploring that comes with the uncomfortable, or, you know, what some would call is exploring 1984 and the genocide, and what does that look like, and maybe reshifting their understanding. I don't have an answer on how do we approach people who don't want to talk about it. I think that personally, the way that I would perhaps bring it up is, that, or if it came up in a conversation, is that, I've looked into this myself, and I think you'd be surprised at the information that you can find out there, and the lived experiences that came out of 84. And you can't let other events paint how you understand something as massive as a genocide like this. And so when you're ready to talk about it, when you think you might have a question, I'm here. And there's no judgment, because we've all been there. And we're still on it. I think we would all here attest that there's elements of 1984, and not just the genocide, but also what it leads you to explore, that we're all still learning about. We all have shortcomings on this that we may, that we don't understand, that we're still exploring. And it leads you down so many different paths that the person that you're asking the most challenging questions to often is yourself. How do you feel about this? What do you see? What do you understand? And I think when it comes to the people that aren't there yet, I think we just need to be ready to be there for them when they want to. But I think hopefully events like this will help, because we show that we're all there. We all have uncomfortable things that we don't want to talk about, or we never thought we'd, question. And we have. So we've all got to start somewhere.
And I'm going to be a terrible moderator. With 1 minute left, I'm going to ask a question. This is where I should be wrapping it up. And Paneet, I think I'm going to give this one to you. There are so many folks who are just looking at, they look at 1947, they look at, and not just these particular moments in time, but ongoing events that have happened where, not just Sikhs, but other marginalized groups in India, it just seems like nothing is really going to change in any substantial way. And if I think back to what Amneet just said, the current trajectory, doesn't inspire a huge amount of hope, especially with the branding of Hindustan and the Bharat Mata, and it's an attack on godliness to be against, to be against your government is basically an attack on something spiritual that people hold dear. So that's a tough one. So people say in moments like this, we need an independent state. We need a Khalistan. We need a home where we can protect our identity, we protect our language, we protect our rights. What hope is there that individual communities, and especially Sikhs, will be able to find justice in this place? And if they cannot, then really, what is there except to try to establish a home where they belong?
That's a big question in the last minute.
I know, with 30 seconds left, right? Like, who does that?
I appreciate it. Can I be a really bad panelist and add something to Guntaas' answer really quickly before I answer that? Yeah. Just very, very quickly, I just want to share an experience from a Vancouver Guldasta that was really important for me, which was, so after each show, there was a talk back. So a community conversation for the chance to, whoever came in the audience, to chat with the actors, myself, the moderator, and each other about their experiences. And because, this was done at the Cult, it was like a 50% perhaps South Asian audience. Most of that was probably Sikh, and then the other half was like mixed. And so in those shows, we heard from like several different communities identifying with what happened. But there was one particular moment where an auntie who was in like a suit got up with 5 minutes left in that panel, and she put her hand up and she got up and she talked about her experience during 84. And her husband was there, he was sitting there. He didn't say anything, he was kind of just nodding along. And it was powerful, it was amazing, it was moving. And at the end, she said, "I'm sorry for speaking." She said, I've never talked about this before in public. I've never talked about this before in public. I think part of the issue, I'm not going to say this is the entirety of the issue, but part of the issue with inviting people into the narrative is the fact that this narrative has been controlled by the same people for 40 years, for far too long. And I'll say this right before as a qualifier, is that I think the sevadars who made the Gurdwara across Canada, across all of North America, have done incredible activism in seva for the last 100 years. They've taken out second, third mortgages on their houses. They've put their personal lives, their livelihoods on the line. But I will say that those same people are still Gurdwara uncles sitting here controlling the narrative, saying that you need to talk about Blue Star this way, you need to talk about the movement this way, and these need to be your feelings on it. But we also don't want you to talk about it. We want you just to agree with us while we have the podium. The Blackbeards that were at the Naujawan of the movement in '84 are the ones who won't let go of the movement now and do succession planning and leadership and mentorship and ustadi, things that our pre-colonial traditions have pushed forward for so long. So that's my little rant about that. I just want to say, until the people who are sympathetic have the space to share narrative, to control narrative, to control the activism. I mean, the people who aren't sympathetic is as a en masse is a hard thing to think about. To your question, Rena, and thank you for the space, and I apologize for taking up so much of it. What is the hope beyond an independent homeland? I will say this again with the qualifier that I'm not going to give anyone my stance on a homeland in this answer, because I think that's too easy, and it doesn't serve the conversation, because that serves my perspective, but not the perspectives that are both informed and uninformed from all sides beyond that. So I mean, there's always a hope. The pursuit of justice is always based on hope, right? Che Guevara had that wonderful quote of, let me say at the risk of sounding ridiculous, that all revolutionaries are guided by the great feelings of love. Sanchit Singh said similarly that we are Sikhs, and we have the power of love bestowed to us by our sixth Guru, Guru Har Gobind Sahib. So I mean, the romanticism, I mean, aside, I think when we start time boxing our goals, then they can become very shallow. And that's not to say that an independent homeland is or is not inherently a shallow idea. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying that when you time box an idea of justice, that is shallow. Saying that in my lifetime, we need to achieve Khalistan is a shallow understanding of what the pursuit of justice entails. To say that we need equal rights in India in my lifetime is a shallow understanding of what the pursuit of justice entails. I think that the goal is always going to be justice, and it's justice for us, it's justice for everyone, it's justice for every human being and soul that we interact with. Again, trying to pull back from the romantic, is the pathways to that are several. And they take shape and manifest over time in different ways. Conversations we're having now, avenues we have now, mediums we have now, as Amneet Singh said, weren't available to us in '84. Things that were available to us in '84, news media, international news media, weren't available to us in '47. Similarly, things that were available to us in '47, not before that, so on and so forth. So to think now that I can cast judgment on what is the right path to justice in the future on something that has no end, I think is in itself a pursuit that's going to leave you unsatisfied. Where we do this thing in storytelling where we identify the arc of the character, and the arc of a character in a story is never going to be fulfilled. It's something that's beyond that any individual story can encapsulate, because it's an abstract idea. It's like, I want acknowledgement by my parents. I want a sense of belonging in my community. I want X, Y, and Z. And this is in storytelling. And then we tell a story. Usually there's a physical manifestation to achieve that goal that speaks to that goal. So I want acknowledgement from my parents might manifest as we're telling a story about a movie about someone who moves away from home to follow their dreams and shatter their parents' expectations and succeed in a field that they never did, and they want to become a movie star, whatever it might be. It's a very, very Bend It Like Beckham scenario there. But it's we start when we conflate what our spine is, what our arc is, and our arc is towards justice for ourselves and for all. And we start saying that this is the only way to get there. I think that in itself is limiting. There are several avenues. There's political advocacy, there's the arts, there's armed revolution, there's everything in between and beyond all of those things. There's changing your community, there's changing yourself, there's changing the world. To time box that and to limit it to any individual goal for everyone would be a foolish endeavor on my part. All I can do is take the steps that best suit myself, my community, and the activists and people around me. And we can work together for that common purpose in the way that we feel best.
Very thoughtfully said. Thank you so much. Wish we could continue the discussion longer, but I know that people have children to take care of, places to be, and I'm grateful to all of you. I'm grateful to WSO, Guntaas, Anita for holding this conversation, allowing me to be part of it. It really has been a pleasure. So thank you so much for your time. We will end this now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.